Number 9, you have to allow popular participation in government. I'm not saying democracy, right? Now, I personally prefer one person, one vote. But even what the Victorians call the popular government, that is the regular franchise for at least some people, that's minimum. And number 10, no slavery. All right? I mean, that should be pretty non-negotiable. And no, slavery does still exist in the world. So, and yet nations that have it are regarded as respectable. So those are my sort of basic 10 right there. And whenever I sort of give this list to people, I say, is it really too much to ask that for the enormous privileges of sovereignty, you control your territory, practice a little bit of religious toleration, allow some freedom of the press, let some people vote regularly, don't have slavery, and have an army that's under some sort of control? Are those demands extreme and unreasonable? Should those not be fairly reasonable, fairly basic, minimum standards of respectability? And if you don't meet them, you're really not fit to call yourself government? Notice I've said nothing here about a lot of things that many people regard as very important. I said nothing about social welfare. People do whatever they want to about that. I have my own preferences, obviously. I'm sure you do too. But that's not really one of the criteria. Nor is coining your own money. You know, because some nations rely essentially on the US dollar as their currency. So these are really very minimal standards. But you know what? If everyone in the world followed them, billions of people in the world would be way better off than they currently are, and we would have to confront way fewer problems than we currently do. Yes, sir?
So if we made the move of saying that Zimbabwe is not a legitimate sovereign government, which I'm assuming is towards the end goal of helping people in Zimbabwe to have a legitimate government.
Yes.
And probably that move in itself, like that wouldn't actually make Mugabe step down, or wouldn't actually directly lead to legitimacy. So like, what avenue would we go down to actually make those differences?
We should bear in mind that when you get to be recognized as a sovereign state, you get privileges. Right? What do you get if you're a recognized sovereign state? You get to be recognized as diplomats. So you have freedom to travel. Right? You can come to the United States, you can come to the UN, and we cannot arrest you. Now, that's a huge privilege. You are, usually, your children can go to the West and be educated there. And many dictators do send their kids to the West. So they're a gigantic privilege. You can invest your money all around the world, and especially in the West. You put it where you want to, but a lot of people do end up keeping it in Western, European or American banks. For example, when the U.S. finally, belatedly decided that Gaddafi really was not terribly respectable, what was almost the first thing that we, far too late in my view, did? We froze his assets, right? The ability to access the U.S. banking system is a gigantic privilege of sovereignty. Take it away. So you go through all the things that states get when they're recognized as sovereign, and states value these things because they take advantage of them so often and they insist on getting them. So take away the advantages. I would love to be in a position where we were sort of, I agree, this is a negative approach. It's imposing pain not on people, but on the elites in the government who are the ones who benefit from these privileges. It is imposing pain on recalcitrant elites by taking away the advantages that they get by participating in the system. There are many places around the world that I think are respectable, but they're not, they're fragile. The rule of law is there, they have good intentions, but it's not, it's not strong enough. There, I think we should try to be helpful. There, I'm in favor not of unconditional aid, certainly not of UN-administered aid, but there I'm certainly in favor of us trying to work with other places to build up the rule of law, to train their armed forces to be more responsible and effective. I think those are case by case, as long as we're in charge and we can assess whether this program is working or not. I think those things are very much in our interests. But there are many cases around the world where the government is fundamentally tyrannical or autocratic and unrespectable, and there working with them is a waste of time. We should take away their privileges, and instead of saying, come on into the system and you'll get better as a result, we should kick them out, take away their advantages, and make them feel some pain, and then reward them when they come back in on the respectable grounds. Our policy, really, Democrat and Republican, for over 60 years has been to say, you're newly independent. You have no track record whatsoever in upholding the basic standards of respectability. What we'll do is we'll admit you into the system with all the rights that belong to it, and we hope that'll make you behave better. But if it doesn't, you're in the system already, and you've got the rights, and you can't be kicked out. That's a real mistake. And I sometimes refer to this as the policy of telling a child, eat all the Brussels sprouts, eat all of your ice cream first. Get sovereignty first, and then you'll eat your Brussels sprouts later on. The sort of difficult stuff about governance and, controlling the armed forces and respecting people's basic rights. Well, you know what states have done? They eat the ice cream first, and then they don't take their Brussels sprouts. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that nations have to behave a certain way to be given sovereignty rights, to be kind of recognized by the international community. But I mean, if we kick all these nations out, there aren't very many nations left in the world. In order to come back in, who says they're going to want to come back in with us and not a power like China, doesn't really care how they behave, as long as they have the natural resources.
That's why I want to start small. That's why I want to, if you approached all the nations in the world, or all the states in the world that deserve this treatment at once, you run into exactly the problem that you define. The problem is too big to be swallowed at one gulp, or probably even at 10. That's why I think this is a generational, maybe even a multi-generational problem, and that what's really important is that we be clear about the intellectual, the policy, and I would argue the moral and practical basis for this kind of policy, and then we start somewhere. I prefer Zimbabwe personally. I could listen to some arguments about Sudan. There's certainly other places that are viable. But yes, but I would point out that sort of the implication, I'm sure this is not what you mean, but the implication of your question is that we really can't do anything, right? Because we're trapped. Because all these places are in, and we're stuck with them. Well, I reject that idea. I reject it partly on moral grounds, I reject it partly on practical grounds, and I reject it because I think ultimately it will lead the U.S. to be less engaged internationally. Because we will be so disgusted by these international organizations and all the problems they create for us as a genuinely respectable place that we'll increasingly opt out. I don't regard that as a good alternative. Therefore, I think that we should have a positive policy now that gives us something to work on, even if it's not the kind of thing you can solve overnight. Yes, sir?
All right, so since we've acknowledged it's a long-term problem, I have two questions about specific standards for international statehood that seem obvious, but I think could warrant, valid concern in the future. The first one is the third standard, which is war is business for the state. My question is actually about states such as that you do consider legitimate, such as Germany, which you mentioned, that don't have a de facto standing army, and why they would qualify. My second question is actually perhaps even more alarming at first, is about slavery. Just because, and not to call into question slavery, I think we, as you said, that's pretty self-explanatory, but one is to say that as, in the long term, that our ethical stance as a sovereign state won't change.
Well, I mean, I hope it won't. Actually, in some respects, I hope that it will, and I'll explain that in a second. On the army front, Germany has an army. Now, they're transitioning from a conscription system to a long service system, and for me, it is strange to say, I wish Germany were a little more warlike right now, which is a paradoxical thing to say. It's strange that one of our biggest problems now is that Germany is hard to pacifist. Boy, wouldn't the guys in 1944 have wished to have these kind of problems? So we should be very grateful. War is the business of the state, but that doesn't mean the state has to be engaged in fighting wars all the time. Bear in mind that the goals of this system are that independent, democratic nation states can work together peaceably and respecting each other's basic diversity while agreeing on a few common standards.